I'm really excited for the topic today. I've been collaborating with ZoomInfo for a little bit while on these webinars, and I was thinking, how do we do something where we can document just kind of principles behind like proven successes? And the two guests today were kind of the two people that came to mind first when we were thinking about guests. And just to give some quick intros, Rod Baptista, we did a webinar, I think a couple of months ago, Rod, but Rod is a newly appointed AE at ZoomInfo. He's landed close to 900 meetings during his time as an SDR. And he's one of my go-to folks on cold calling, especially. We've done a lot of content on that. Good to have you, Rod.
Great to be
Kyle.
here.
Yeah, you bet. Kyle Coleman. We've kind of seen a lot of each other's content, but only gotten to talk to each other. This is the second time we've talked to each other, so it's good to talk to Kyle. The reason why I thought of Kyle for this is he's the SVP of marketing at Clary, first off. But I think in your profile, or you wrote a post about how you landed 604 meetings in 18 months as an SDR. And when people asked you about it, you talked about the $3 million of ARR that it created. And I just love the revenue focus that Kyle takes to prospecting and being an SDR and that sort of stuff. So Kyle, good to have you here as well.
Pleasure being here. Really looking forward to this.
Okay, so today we're going to kind of unpack how between these two, they've landed around 1,497 meetings as SDRs. So kind of a gargantuan number. So a couple things real quick. Yes, because people are asking, it's going to be recorded. We'll send this out afterwards. We're going to try to, we have, there's 888 people on the webinar today. So there's probably going to be a lot of questions. If those come in, use the Q&A button. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But if you want to get your question answered, make sure you drop it into the Q&A. Okay, so first question I want to kick over, Kyle, to you. As an SDR, were there any kind of hesitations, fears, doubts? Like, take me back to like your first couple days, if you can remember, to your SDR job. What was that like, and what was the kind of the thinking and the mindset at that time?
Absolutely, fears and doubts and uncertainty and call reluctance and pretty much every struggle under the sun that I'm sure Rod, J Bay, you've been through yourself. I went through. I was alone. I was the first and only SDR at my company, so I didn't even have a shoulder to cry on. I just had myself in my own head inventing all of these impractical scenarios about all these terrible things that could go wrong if I picked up the phone. And what I realized pretty quickly, and based on some advice that I had from a few mentors of mine, was you don't need to know all of the answers as an SDR or even as a salesperson. Nobody at your company knows how everything works end to end, from how the tech is created to how CPQ processes go. Nobody knows all that stuff. And you're not expected to either. And so as soon as I understood that it wasn't about knowing all the answers, it was about asking the right questions, that was a huge unlock for me. And so how did I learn about how to ask the right questions? Deep dive on personas, deep dive on the people that I was reaching out to, not just what they do day to day, but how are they measured? What are their success criteria? Who do they report to? What are the things that are hard for them? Really steeping myself in their worlds, listening to their podcasts, reading the newsletters that they read, going to the events that they went to, like really becoming a student of the people that I was selling to. Again, back to the psychological principles here. That was what gave me this kind of the foundation, I should say, of confidence that allowed me to get over the call reluctance. I knew their world really well. I knew what they cared about, and I could guide a conversation by asking questions. And when somebody asked me a question I didn't know the answer to, I was confident enough to say, that's a really good question. I have no idea, but I know the person who does know the answer. Are you free Tuesday at 2 to have that conversation? And that became my response to everything. So very long way of saying, really know your personas and build that confidence that you can ask them meaningful questions. And that unlocks so much for folks that are experiencing any sort of fear or uncertainty, doubt, call reluctance.
You hit on something, and I think that's super important. With the SDRs and BDR teams that I work with, there is this, hey, I'm first year, second year, maybe into my sales role. Why would an executive with 20 years of experience want to talk to me? What could I possibly share with this person? And what I'm hearing from you is, hey, you don't need to be the expert that knows everything about everything. You're just like really narrow in this niche of what you do, but more importantly, knowing about their world. And speaking of psychology, I mean, Robert Cialdini's influence, one of the principles is likability. And it's like the likability is not like being liked by the prospect, but just showing that you're a peer and you know about their world, is really interesting. Rod, you talk a lot about customer voice. I think this is a good place to kind of start our conversation. And for everyone else, we'll get into the cold calling tactics and all that other stuff. Like where we're kind of setting this up is for both of these folks, a big part of your guys' success has been like being able to really sit in the seat of the people that you're speaking with, right? And Rod, you talk a lot about customer voice. So from a messaging standpoint, let's just talk like what are some of the things that you did as an SDR and continue to do as an AE, to really like sit in the seat and really get to know who your prospects are and what they care about?
Yeah, basically everything that Kyle was talking about, consuming the content, going to where they go physically, digitally, virtually, putting myself in as much as I could in their shoes. And it is a difficult mentality to think about how can I speak like, if I'm talking to VPs of sales, which I am every day, how can I speak like a VP of sales? How can I sound credible if I'm just some person who's fresh out of college? Maybe this is my first job. Maybe as it was in my case, it was my first job in business to business sales. Everything was very new. How could they ever find me to be credible? And the answer is your language. Yes. It literally just comes down to your language, and you'll get it's a combination of your language and control what you can't control. A lot of people will talk to you about, your tone and, your enunciation, all of these different kinds of things. Everybody has a speaking style that they feel comfortable with. Whatever your speaking style is, whatever your writing style is, where you feel most comfortable, go with that and just pay very specific attention, not just in the content that you're consuming, but especially if you're getting people on the phone, pay attention to the very specific language they use, especially as it relates to their job. One of the examples I think I've beaten to death at this point was one of the first clients I represented was selling a physical security technology solution to chief CSOs, chief security officers, or VPs of asset protection. And one of the first things I picked up on was the fact that I'd be like, I would call them early in the morning or whenever. I'd be like, "How's it going?" They're like, "Oh, just putting out fires over here." And I learned how the fire allegory and metaphor was so like literally and figuratively is significant for that persona that I got made fun of by my fellow SDRs afterwards for always starting my calls with like, "Hey, I know you're just putting out fires over there. Ha 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 ha." That would get laughs. That would get laughs, and nothing else makes me sound like a peer to make the kind of jokes that they're making.
Let's ask the audience actually. So we hit the 1,000 like participants, you guys. This is pretty cool. We got 1,000 folks on here. What are some of the analogies and metaphors that your prospects use? Let us know in the chat. I'm really curious to see and test the understanding of the audience here. What are some analogies or metaphors that your prospects use on a day-to-day basis?
I'll continue that, what Rod just said, like, yes, putting out the fires. And what I realized, Rod, is that the way that I used to frame things, some people or some SDRs, BDRs are trained to say, what's keeping you up at night? And that is like the most tired, overused phrase that people have a really hard time responding to, because it's like, I'm not always thinking about work. Anyway, so yes, putting out fires. And the way that I ended up asking this question, what our team says now is, what's the most brightly burning fire for you right now? It's like, I know you've got a sea of flame out there. What is the fire that's burning most brightly, and how can we, and here's how, and then they'd answer, and then we can segue into, well, here's how we're helping extinguish that fire for people just like you. I just talked to, and then again, building credibility. How are you going to prove to this VP of sales or this chief revenue officer that you know them? And this little quip that I train people to use, that I use a lot, is, I just talked to a CRO this morning, and here's what they said. Or in my last 8 conversations with CROs, in my last 4 conversations with VPs of sales, here's what they said. It's the end of, or just start of Q4. They're worried about territory planning for next year, and they're worried about closing the year. Is that what's top of mind for you? And of course they're going to say yes. And so that is the bridge to, close that credibility gap that Rod, you mentioned. So love the analogies, but also like build that credibility by showing them, like telling them that you speak to people like them all the time. So little tip for everybody.
I love that. That's the customer voice that we always talk about in action right there. I'm literally talking to people like you. There's demonstrates, credibility, business acumen, all of that kind of stuff just in one or two simple statements. If you guys look at the chat, it's kind of funny.
Herding cats.
Mouth in
Or
a fire hose,
up
running
to
out
my
of
butt,
bandwidth.
up to my butt in alligators. That one I've heard plenty. That's a good one.
Yeah, I think this is a good. It's kind of a cool opportunity, especially over the phone, to just have a little bit of humor and bring a little bit of levity to the situation. You know what I mean? And that could be really powerful in a call. Kyle, you have some very specific things, some exercises that you train people on to go through to figure out what that language is. So what are some things that a rep or a sales leader can do with their team to figure out what are the stuff that prospects care about?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So a lot of this will come and my answer to a lot of these things is process. Like you have to be very intentional about what you're trying to learn, and you have to create a process to learn that thing. So if you're using a conversational intelligence tool, like at Clary, we use Wingman. We just acquired a company called Wingman. And so we're looking through the transcripts, we're reviewing calls, we're listening to what we say, we're seeing how people respond to those things. And it's not a true A/B test because it's not necessarily super volume based or data oriented. It's more of a qualitative check, and CI tools are great for that. On the other side, kind of the truer A/B test, email. This is one of my favorite things about cold email. Your marketing team may have beautiful language, but it's language that mostly is inside out. So inside the company, served out to the world. And that's useful, but it's really just the best laid thoughts of your marketing team. What's beautiful about outbound is that you get an outside in perspective on the language that's working, the language that's resonating. So be very intentional when you're testing these things, structure some tests and use different words or phrases in subject lines and just see what gets the better open rate, what gets the better reply rate, what are people objecting to, what are people saying yes to. If you can structure those things over time, you're going to have a really useful library of what to say, what not to say, what to avoid, what to double down on, all those sorts of things. So it just takes intent, it takes process, and it takes a little bit of time and patience, but it is well worth it because the words that are useful in an email need to become infused across your talk tracks, your call scripts, your voicemails, your video messages, and all of that. So it's really, really useful to run both of those experiments. If you have the CI product, listen to your calls, listen to your team's calls, understand what's working, what isn't. And then everybody has some sort of email engagement tool. Use those to structure intentional A/B tests and learn from the subject lines that are getting the most resonance or the most interaction, most engagement, what your target audience is actually most interested in.
Yeah, and if you're an SDR or BDR, you have access to these recordings from account executives. Pick your top account executives or the ones you're setting meetings for. And to your point, Kyle, go through and literally look. I think that a really big missed opportunity is not using the sales conversations to inform outbound messaging.
Yeah.
Because prospects will open up about problems and priorities and goals and things like that a little bit more in a sales call usually. So Rod, if we kind of keep this going, we've kind of got the messaging piece. When you're thinking about personas, what do you really want to make sure that you understand about a persona? And where I'm kind of going there is stuff like KPIs they might be measured by, like that kind of stuff. Like what things do you want to make sure to understand about a persona outside of the priorities and things that they kind of care about right now?
That's a good question. And just a quick side note, Kyle, if I didn't know that you were a salesperson wearing a marketing hat, I would now. After what you just said, that was awesome. The biggest thing, I mean, obviously, knowing the KPIs is good. Knowing some of the minute details of what they're focused on is good. As an SDR, I'm always trying to achieve that balance of how much of my time do I invest into an email, a call, whatever, versus how many of those activities I can produce. So for that reason, the biggest one thing I always try to very quickly identify about a persona is, what are some of their challenges? So at a first glance, at a first sweep, figure out what are some of their challenges, period. What is difficult about being a vice president of sales? What's tough about marketing? And then once you kind of start with that mindset of what is hard for them, you can go further and say, what's hard for them within their industry? What's difficult for VPs of sales in SaaS? And a lot of times it's kind of like hiring talent, right? Once you build the muscle of figuring out what is a good challenge, how do you learn about challenges? How do you ask questions? And if you pitch your solution and it doesn't resonate and you don't end up getting the meeting, go for gold. Ask them questions until they hang up on you. Try to learn as much as you can on every opportunity you have to interact with the prospect, to pay attention to their language, to learn about their challenges, right? And once you have a better, once you've worked out the muscle of, what are their challenges, then you can work out the muscle of what are their challenges as that relates to my product, my solution, my service, what I'm trying to do.
I think what I hear there too is your advice is do this backwards in how most companies typically onboard and train. Most companies start with use cases and products, and some big companies too, like some very big successful companies. It's product, use cases, versus flipping that on its head and thinking about personas. Like, what do these people care about? Where they run into challenges, and how do we kind of back in to product and use cases? So just for everyone watching, because I know there's kind of people joining in and out here, what we've kind of covered first is this messaging piece, the knowing what to say. Before we talk about cold calling or cold email or any of that kind of stuff, knowing what to populate those mediums with, super important with these two. It sounds like that's been a really big part of your success. If we shift gears a bit and focus more on targeting, I call it ICPs. Kyle, you guys call it ICPs. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what that is and its role as an SDR or an account executive or anyone prospecting, like the targeting piece?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a moment. I want to just share this. I shared it in the chat, but I want to share it here as well, because I think it dovetails nicely, Rod, from what you were saying about understanding personas. And I think it wraps everything up. I know Jason and Rod, we even looked at this as we were prepping for the webinar, but here are some thoughts on my thoughts, I should say, on different levels of understanding your personas. Most training stops here. Most training just stops on what they do. And to really understand your personas, you need to get into all four of these different levels, of what folks are paying attention to. So I shared it. Oh, Jason, you reshared it in the chat. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that people saw this, because I think it's really important. And there's plenty more. Like, this is obviously pretty high level, but if you understand all four of these different levels that I'm clicking through here, you're going to be in really good shape to execute on everything that Rob just talked about. And to Jason's point, set yourself up nicely to have effective calls and to write effective emails. So just thank you. ICP versus ICT. So ICP is the ideal customer profile. This is typically an account level understanding of what does an account look like? What industry are they in? How big are they? What technology do they use? Ideal customer profile, very useful to kind of limit the universe from all of the accounts that you could possibly reach out to some manageable subset of the accounts that you should reach out to, not just to book meetings, but to book meetings that will actually turn into revenue. If you're booking a meeting with a company that has no chance of actually buying your product or solution, you're wasting your time and you're wasting your company's time and resources. So really understanding your ICP is critical. If you don't do that, if your company doesn't do that, do it immediately. Make sure that you have some rationale for which companies you're reaching out to and why. Now, to take that to the next level, ICT is the ideal customer title. There's this really important distinction that I draw when I'm speaking with SDRs, when I'm training folks on how to do this, to know which of the people that you're reaching out to are above the line decision makers and which of the people in your buying group are below the line use case champions. Both are very useful, but you need to know who plays what role in the buying experience. Because when you're setting meetings that turn into revenue, you need to be setting those meetings with people that can actually move the ball forward from an evaluation standpoint. Those are your above the line decision makers. However, you cannot and should not completely ignore the people that are below the line use case champions. I'll use Rod's example. Rod mentioned he's selling to VPs of sales. Ultimately, yes, you want to get that meeting with a VP of sales. But if I reach out to 5 AEs that's at this VP of sales company, and I learn a little bit about their processes, what's difficult for them, what's going well, what their quotas are, just whatever it is about their day-to-day. And I can send that VP of sales an email that says, I just talked to Maya, Val, and Lynn, and here is what I learned about your business, and here's how I can help. You better believe you're going to get some sort of positive reaction from that VP of sales and really move the ball forward in an accelerated sort of way. So know the people that you need to be reaching out to, and importantly, know how you should be reaching out to them. I'm not going to reach out to that VP of sales and offer him a $5 Starbucks gift card. That is meaningless to him. But if I reach out to those account executives and I say, hey, coffee's on me, 5 minutes, just trying to learn about how you do X, Y, or Z, they're going to respond much more positively to that. And that's the ammunition that I need to then go above the line. So segment your prospects, know where that power line distinction is, who's above it, who's below it, and your outreach strategies need to change based on what side of the power line you're reaching out to.
I love that. The above the line versus below the line. Skip Miller wrote a great book that if you're watching, you should check out, Selling Above and Below the Line. It's really, really good. Really good information on that. So I don't know about you guys. I'm kind of curious what you see. Where I tend to see reps run into trouble is with those above the line personas. And if I'm going to go to reach out to executive, there tends to be just a lot of product, talk and a lot of feature benefit kind of stuff. Rod, you mind providing an example of, like, if you were talking to, let's say, a BDR manager about Zoom Info versus a VP of sales, just so the audience has some example, what are some differences in what those two people might care about?
So just to kind of synthesize everything we've talked about so far. So a BDR manager versus a VP of sales. If you've done a good job up until this point, you know that a BDR manager is closer to the ground, closer to the front lines, whatever language you might like to put it. They're focused on making sure that their direct hires are hitting their numbers, right? They're salespeople, they're individual contributors. A VP of sales sits somewhere above that, where they're managing managers, or depending on the size of the organization, they're managing directors, and they're less focused on, they have less interest in how are the individuals are doing versus how are teams doing, how is a product doing, how is a department doing, right? That scope of focus and interest means a world of difference in terms of what they care about on the day-to-day. And to take that into the thing we just talked about with the challenges, it changes what your challenges are, right? As a BDR manager, one of your biggest challenges, especially right now with how strong the labor market in the US is in favor of labor, of talent. There are more job openings than there are applicants right now. What a BDR manager might be struggling to hire people. They might be struggling to get butts in seats. They might be struggling to get the people to produce the metrics that they're graded on, right? A VP of sales is going to be less focused on, are we hiring people for our teams? That's my BDR manager's job. They're going to be more focused on, how are we pacing on the year? How are we pacing on the month? How are we pacing on the quarter? What are we doing? And how are we? A VP of sales might also be more focused on, how are we coordinating with marketing, right? Coordination, sales and marketing coordination sometimes happens at that high of a level. Ideally, it goes all throughout the organization. But once you have a good understanding of the persona, then you can start to either guess at some of what their challenges are. And in an email, you can put, like, hey, from speaking with a lot of business development managers, they're telling me that hiring's really tough right now, right? Or you can say that on the phone. Try a challenge. Have them tell you you're wrong, and then ask them, oh, if that's not the case, then what is? Well, that's really cool that you're not suffering from that. Everybody I talk to is. What makes your company so different? What makes you so successful? If you ask these kinds of questions, if you come into it using their language, you can really, and building this credibility, you can ask these kinds of questions that are gonna return to you the information you're looking for. Jason, I forgot the question you asked me.
Well, you answered it very nicely. It was,
Excellent.
just so people, the distinguishing distinguishing the messaging, excuse me, between above the line and below the line and how we talk to these folks differently.
And actually, just to double click on something I think somebody shared in the comments, if you're below the line, 1,000,000% leverage that explicitly to your advantage and say, hey, listen, man, I'm not looking to close a deal with you. I'm not looking to do business with you. You know, if you're reaching out to salespeople, for example, or like, hey, from salesperson to salesperson, right? Or as a peer, you know, from somebody in your field, you know, as somebody who speaks with a lot of directors of IT, managers, if you're below the line, leverage that. Tell them, I'm not, you know, the purpose of my call isn't to schedule time with you. I just want to see if it even makes sense for me to reach out to your company. I just want to have a good understanding of your world. Leverage that.
Love that, Rod. And what I'll say to answer Jason's question, I think it's very similar to what Rod said, is for folks that are below the line, like Rod said, they're closer to the day-to-day. They are responsible for the day-to-day, for the execution of process. For folks that are above the line, they're just more removed from the day-to-day. They're not so much focused on the execution or implementation of process. They're focused on the higher level strategies of the company. So for example, a chief revenue officer may be more interested in how they're going to expand internationally and build a team in APAC. They have a team right now in North America. Now, great, things are humming along. I need to focus on building a team in APAC. That's what the chief revenue officer is focused on. But the individual AE, especially an individual AE who's in North America, they don't give a hoot, pardon my language, about the expansion into APAC. They are focused on the day-to-day execution of getting meetings, moving deals forward, closing business. And so knowing that distinction and focusing your above the line messaging on those longer term strategic initiatives that you can uncover when you're doing account research in 10Ks or in funding announcements or in press releases that the company does or interviews that the C-suite does or whatever it is, tying into those strategic initiatives is the way to go for folks that are above the line. And of course, making sure that your value prop matches. How can you support that international expansion as an example? But focusing more on the day-to-day of the folks that are below the line and the pain points. We call it the pains and gains. So what is the pain that they're experiencing? And what is the gain that they'll realize by using your solution? And focusing on that sort of formula for messaging for folks that are below the line typically is a better way to have it both ways and have effective messaging above and below.
Love it. And people are letting you know, Kyle, that they're okay with you saying hoot.
Oh, that's a relief. Okay, good.
One last question before we get into kind of the different channels and phone, the email game, that kind of stuff. How do you recommend that? I'll kick this question your way first, Rod. If you were given 100 accounts, let's say, how would you prioritize which ones to go after first? And the reason I ask that is that a lot of times people work in account lists from top to bottom. It's like, oh, I'm given a big list of accounts. Let's just start alphabetically and work my way down versus where's the low hanging fruit here? You know, so how do you think about, Rod, prioritizing accounts, folks that you're reaching out to really look for the opportunities where you're going to have the most likelihood for success?
The one caveat I'll give before I answer the question is having no strategy is better than investing too much time into a strategy. If you spend your first month and as a new SDR, as a new account executive, whatever individual contributor role you have, and that entire month you're thinking about, you know, how am I going to approach this list? At that point, it's more valuable for you to just go top down. You know, there's always that break-even point of my time versus my activities. How can I be effective? How can I attain a good balance of both? That being said, really easy ways to segment your account are what are some of your historically good customers, and having a good understanding of. I'm lucky that at ZoomInfo, although we have 30,000 customers across every single kind of industry, we have really well-defined metrics I can use to say, in the logistics industry, what is the annual revenue? What is the average annual revenue of the companies that we're talking to? And do we usually get in the logistics, do we usually get in with managers, or are we usually having our first conversations right with the VP level, right? So going into your existing, the best way to figure out your how to prioritize, how to figure out low-hanging fruit is looking at your existing customer list and extrapolating from that your ideal customer profile and your ideal customer title, right? That's super easy. There's a lot more that can go into it, but I feel like I want to add I want to let Kyle add some color to this as well. I feel like he's got some really interesting points on this.
I love exactly where your head's at there, Rod. You need to have some sort of, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but intentional prioritization of the accounts that you have on your list. Every account is not created equal. There are certain indicators of higher intent. If you have an intent tool like 6sense or like Demandbase or something like that, great.
Or like ZoomInfo.
Or like ZoomInfo. If you have a marketing automation system, like Marketo or something like that, where you can see who's coming to your website, that's an intent indicator as well. So you can use those other signals to say this person is more or less likely, or this account is more or less likely to be in the market for a solution like ours. So if you're lucky enough to have that technology, you better be using that technology. So that's one thing. The second thing, I'll go back to the definition of the ICP. There's a concept that it's going to sound very technical. I promise it isn't. Is this concept of a technographic score, which is to say, and again, you can use ZoomInfo for a lot of this. What other technology do our customers use? Customers of Clary are very likely to use ZoomInfo, to use Salesforce. And so if I already know that, some subset of my account list is already using those vendors, they shoot to the top of my list because they've shown an inclination to purchase or invest in technology like mine. Very simple, but it takes that little extra bit of elbow grease for reps to do. And therefore, most people totally skip it. So again, if you're lucky enough to have enrichment, if you're lucky enough to have the data, if you have intent tools, use them and find some way to make sure that things are, you're prioritizing correctly. One other thing I'll say is that a lot of companies' investment is based on their overall performance as a company. So if you have Sales Navigator, look at what their growth, their headcount growth has been over the last 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is. Look for those indicators of companies that, especially right now in this macroeconomic environment, not everybody is facing a headwind. Some companies are facing, are experiencing a tailwind. Go and look at what their headcount growth has been. Go look at what their funding has been. Just try and get a sense for the companies that may not be struggling as much as other companies are, and they should shoot to the top of your list as well.
And the last missing piece is triggers. If you can identify that every single one of your previous customers has the same trigger where they always bought your solution or your service right when there was a new CRO in place, there was a new CEO, there were changes at the executive level, or maybe they just got funding, or maybe they just laid off a bunch of people. If you can identify easily by, again, a value, all of this information comes from, in large cases, looking at your existing customers. If you can identify like, oh man, this is a pretty common trigger I see coming up over and over again, now you can look for it.
Yes.
Yep.
Great.
And if you have the sales nav, just to kind of add on this, you guys hopefully, we'll send out the recording, like definitely make sure to write some of these down because it can help you quickly find those 10 accounts in your list of 100 that are going to be like very likely to want to meet with you. If you got the sales nav hook up with Salesforce, which most people will, if you're working at a software company typically, there's a couple other searches that are kind of cool too. Past employees of current clients is a really easy, very straightforward. Who used to work at a company that's a current client of ours? That's a really big one. And I want to double down on, I think, Rod, you had mentioned it, just looking back at where are our customer stories and case studies the strongest, and where do I, as an AE or my AE, if I'm setting up meetings for them, like where do we tend to have the highest closing rates, shortest sales cycles, largest deal sizes? Like a lot of that information is really accessible, where you can at least narrow down an industry in a particular type of situation. So LinkedIn Sales Nav, the spotlight section, there's a lot of just great little searches that you can do to prioritize accounts and people to reach out to. One last one that I think is really underlooked. Who do you have the best contact information for? ZoomInfo, as much as I love it, it's, I think, the best data provider out there, but it doesn't have data for everyone. There's no software that has 100% coverage for everyone at the accounts that you're reaching out to. So part of that too, who do you have the best contact information for? Who do you have direct dials for? You can prioritize based on that too. Okay, I want to shift gears. But so far we've talked about this targeting piece, which we just talked about. We talked about messaging. Now I want to give the people what they came for, this channel mastery. So how does this get executed on the phone? email, that sort of stuff. Kyle, I want to kick this first question your way. If we just look kind of like at the contact strategy in general, what's the approach from a sequencing or cadencing type of, approach? How many times are we reaching out to people? Do you recommend across what channels, over what time period? How do you kind of generally approach the strategy of just your contact approach?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And as with every good question, and I always annoy people with the answer, but the answer is it depends. It depends who you're reaching out to. It depends on your segment. It depends on what your prospects respond to. And it depends what you excel at. And so you have to find the convergence of all those different factors to find the thing that works for you. But again, it takes process. And so I'm gonna share my screen again here unprompted. I know Jason didn't tell you I was going to do this, but one of the ways that one of the things that made me successful as an individual contributor, and one of the things that makes our teams so successful, is this repeatable process. And so I have this concept of these checklists that I think are pretty useful. I'll share it in the chat right now. But going through and understanding what are the things that make a good email, and whenever you're writing that email, making sure that you're checking all of these boxes. And similarly, when you're preparing for cold calls and when you're making cold calls, making sure that you're abiding by all of these different this checklist is very useful. I'll go down the line and say similarly for video messaging. When you are doing that, just making sure, and I know a lot of people say, well, I do this all day, every day. Like, of course I'm going to get it right. Surgeons do this. Pilots do this. Every professional has a checklist to make sure that they're not overlooking the basics, that they're not skipping the simple stuff that makes the biggest difference. The simple stuff that makes the biggest difference. So you're not too good for it. Nobody on this call is too good for it. I look at this all the time when I'm doing my own prospecting work now, because yes, I am still prospecting. Then actually, Jason, to the question you asked, and again, I'll share this. This is a little calculator that we have that helps our team understand what activity mix they need to execute based on the conversion rates that they experience for these different activity types. I firmly believe that every SDR needs to do a high quantity of high quality outreach. And the main 5 categories, you see them across the top. And so if you know your conversion rates, which is to say, how many dials does it take for me to have a conversation? How many conversations does it take for me to have a meeting? Then I know how many calls I'm going to make in a week. I can commit to 200 calls this week, or I can commit to 300 calls this week, or whatever it is. And the calculator says I can expect 1.5 meetings out of that. And then you look all the way across the right, and what you have here is the total activities you need to execute this week and the total meetings that on average you're going to get from these activities. So you can ratchet this up and down, and you can design your week around the total amount of activities that you need to create in order to be successful. And this is what it's all about. You have to really understand your process. You have to really understand what works and what doesn't work, what you're strong at, what you're weak at, so you can design your week, and you can go improve. You can go talk to the person on your team who's writing killer emails and say, how are you getting a 25% response rate? It's incredible. And similarly, they're not going to be the best person perhaps at making calls. And so they can work with you and they can say, how are you getting this conversion rate on your calls? And you can start to make each other better by really understanding what you're excelling at and what you're weak at. But the most important thing here is that it goes into, one other thing I'm going to share. It goes into the way that you, what I call design your week. So you have this activity mix that you've landed on. You know that you need to execute these activities. And then you design your week to intentionally set time to go and execute these tasks. If I'm committing to 200 calls a week, I need to block enough time to make 200 calls. Otherwise, you're not doing your job. And this kind of intentionality, this kind of process is what allowed me to be individually successful. And it's what has allowed our teams to be successful as well. So I don't care, honestly, Jason and Rod, and maybe this is a little controversial. I don't care if your first touch is an email, or if your first touch is a LinkedIn connection, or if your first touch is a cold call. I just care that you're executing the broad mix of activities that you need to hit in order to be successful, and that when you're executing them abiding by the best practices. And in the long run, it's going to take care of itself. So that's my long answer to a pretty simple question. So I hope that hit the mark.
Let's pick everyone's jaw up off the floor, Kyle, real quick first. Holy shit.
That was incredible.
Yeah. We dropped every links to that in the chat, you guys. So check out the chat. We can drop it again here in a second. So really, what I'm hearing here is
can I
know
comment
your
something
sales
on that?
path. Yeah, absolutely.
So real quick, from somebody who was more recently an SDR, that is so amazing. And I think that for a lot of organizations, you're not going to have something that's nearly as well built as that going into it. Nobody's going to tell you, okay, so, they might tell you how many calls they want you to make, how many emails they want you to send. It's not often that they'll tell you what the conversion rates are, what the quality rates are, some of those things. As an SDR, if you're going into it and in all odds, you don't have something like this in place, it's not that hard to put something together. You have access to your own numbers. Figure it out. If I call 500 people, if I called 500 people this week, how many meetings did I generate? What are my numbers? At Vorsight, the first company I worked at, my CEO would randomly come up to people and he would grill us on our numbers. Always know your numbers. And if you convert amazingly on the phone, know your numbers, know your conversion rates for the phone. If your thing is writing really detailed, beautiful email messages that get you meetings, go to where the money is. Kyle isn't as focused on the activities as he is on the results. If you're getting the meetings that you're supposed to, if you're hitting your numbers, it's not so important how many calls you're making, how many emails you're sending out. You're doing your job. So figure out what your numbers look like for you and which channel you're strongest in, and do one of those columns for yourself if it's not already done for you. I just wanted to drop that.
It's a great call, because like the way, and a lot of SDR managers, especially older school ones, a lot of sales managers will hyper focus on activities. And what I found, this calculator, it frees reps to go and execute the mix that they want to execute because they're confident it's going to get results. And I promise you, your manager, your sales leader, they care way more about repeatable results than they care about how many calls you make. So if you can show them that you have intentionally designed your week in order to generate results that will lead to revenue, that is how you can overcome perhaps some institutional inertia around, oh no, well, we have to make 500 calls. It's like, well, do you? What you really need is you need to get 5 meetings every week. And here's how you can do that. So a really helpful way for you to have that conversation if you have an older school manager.
Yeah, I love this. There's one thing I want to point out and make sure that doesn't get glossed over is on that calendar you shared, there's specific activity associated with the time. And it's, I think, scientific management theory, right? Like back in the day, like when the assembly line, before that was a thing, people didn't really manage employees like that. They didn't think about metrics and things, And I think just if you treat yourself like a business, and look at like what's the output and how many calls can I make in an hour? If I need to personalize emails, how many can I do in an hour? Like looking at it like that, you take your sales math and you can extrapolate all of those numbers onto the calendar, and you basically reverse engineer like your entire week that way. Because I notice a lot of people are not really sure like how much time to schedule for stuff. So that kind of answers that for you. So big takeaway there, know your sales math. We drop the calculators, all that kind of stuff in the chat. When we start to think about channel mastery, I want to we obviously don't have enough time right now to do a deep dive on each of these, but I want to give some actionable tips. So Rod, I'll kick this question your way. Phone. What are some key tips and insights that you have around what you feel has been successful for you over the phone? So if I go to call a prospect, what are one or two things that you find to be very effective that work for you?
Yeah. At this stage in my career, I look for one really actionable piece of information that I can leverage within the first 15 to 20 seconds of the call. Like, hey, I saw that you've been with the company for 7 years now, something like the person's tenure at the organization. I've gotten to the point where I can very smoothly transition that into an intelligent question, right? And my process is always very focused on talking about the individual first, talking about the prospect, not leading with me, not leading with my company, not leading with my product, talking about them first. And the very first thing I'm going to say is something very specific about them, like, hey, I know you've been leading sales for 7 years now. I'm curious. And then I add in some sort of question that's going to direct me in the direction I want the conversation to go. Like, I'm curious, most people I talk to with your level of tenure, they're buying business to business data, or their teams are sourcing it themselves. What are you doing? So one takeaway is find one piece of information, at least one piece of information that you're comfortable leveraging and that you can easily turn into the next step in the conversation, whether that's a question, like, most people tell me they're doing this or that, whether it's an ask, I know you've been with the company for 7 years now. I'd love to connect with you and understand more about your role. Whatever it is, lead with something about them, something specific that you're comfortable leveraging. And then the other thing is, if you've done a good job of understanding that challenge, turn that into the kind of question they're going to want to answer, right? You're going to want to use some client voice, some voice of customers, it's also known. In speaking with other vice presidents of sales, you're going to want to use some of the departmental knowledge and the knowledge you have of what their challenges are. They're telling me that oftentimes they're focused on growing a new product or focusing really on the strategy, and the day-to-day gets away from them and their teams miss their numbers. Whatever, build some kind of challenge that has a good chance of resonating with them based on your level of understanding of the persona, and then give it a shot, and then end that challenge with an open-ended question. Most sales leaders, most VPs of sales with your level of tenure are telling me they're either buying data or their teams are sourcing it all themselves. What are you guys doing? Which boat are you in? How are you tackling that? Ask an open-ended question. Let them answer. If you've done a good job, you're going to get more. You're not going to get a yes or no answer because you didn't give yourself that out.
What I'm hearing from you, and this is something that I've been teaching a lot lately too, is to open up with something that's personalized. So either trigger something from their LinkedIn profile, whatever it might be, like first 10, 15, 20 seconds, I'm opening up with something about that individual, if possible, or something very specific to their company. So if we kind of stay on that theme, Kyle, how do you think about the first 30 seconds of the cold call?
Very similarly to what Rod said. And what I'll say is that if you're doing the account research, no matter how little or how much account research you're doing, you should have some sort of nugget that is going to resonate with the person that you're responding to. One of the reasons that I typically, my process was always to start with an email was because I liked to get my thoughts written down in a concise way, not just to send the email, but also, as I mentioned before, because that became my call script. To Rod's point, like if I write a good email, it's conversational in nature, I should be able just to read it out loud. And that's my voicemail, or that's my cold call opener, or that becomes my video message. And so part of what I like to do is I like to, exactly what Rod said, start with the first line of the email, of the phone conversation, of the video message, whatever it is, with that either point of personalization or point of resonance with the persona. So there's the person who went to the University of Michigan, and I maybe know something about the college. I can talk about that personally, or something about the persona. They're a VP of sales. Their brightest burning fire is figuring out how they can forecast more accurately because right now it's a disaster. And one of those two things I can latch onto, and I can create that and use that as the opener in my cold calls or in whatever forum I'm reaching out to folks using.
I think one thing to highlight, just so people don't miss it, that you said is you basically repurpose and reuse messaging.
Yes.
And some people, I feel like the approach is they think they have to reinvent the wheel. Every time I send an email or voicemail, well, what if the person listens to the voicemail and they see the email is the same message? That's good, actually. And Kyle,
it's not cheating.
It's an impression, dude.
Totally.
It's
exactly.
a marketing.
100%.
That messaging across those channels. So repurpose, reuse. I need something on the person or the persona. For you two, I'll just kind of pose this question. When you're doing research and looking for this stuff, how long will you spend? I know that question can kind of depend on who you're reaching out to and like the size of the account and your sales cycle and that sort of stuff. But when is enough enough? When are you just like, okay, what I have is good enough and I just need to move on? I think a lot of people get bogged down in this.
I'll jump in real quick. I did a whole podcast on this topic with the guys from 30 Minutes to President's Club. It was like their third ever episode, so it's buried in the archives. But if you want to check it out, what we talked about is this 5 by 5 by 5 methodology for researching individual people inside of accounts. And what this means is that you're spending 5 minutes to find 5 key pieces of information, and then you're spending 5 minutes writing the email that's about that one piece of information you found. So 5 minutes, this is not easy. It takes time, it takes practice. When people start, it takes closer to 15 minutes or 20 minutes to find 5 things. But what's useful is that you end up looking for the same thing over and over and over again, because you know what you can write good emails around, what you can have good conversations around. So I want to know, where did they go to school? What charities do they donate to? What has their headcount growth been over the last 6 months? What industry are they in? And when was their last funding round? Just, making that up. But if those are the 5 things I always look for, it's very likely I'm going to be able to find them in 2 minutes. And if I can get really good at that, and I know I can write good emails around those 5 things, then I can write the email in 5 minutes or less, and I'm on my way. So that, it's aspirational, it's hard, it's like building any other muscle, but finding 5 things. And the reason I say 5 is because then your sequence, you have done all the research up front. And when you're reaching out to that person over the course of a handful of weeks, you can write 5 unique emails, and you've already done the research. So research once on a person, log your notes somewhere, and then drip those little bits of information out over the course of the sequence. And that is typically the right way to make this scale. Otherwise, you end up spending way too much time. But again, don't be intimidated if you're trying this out and it takes you a little bit more time to do the research. It takes you a little bit more time to write when you start. It's like building any other muscle. You're not going to go outside and run a 5-minute mile today if you've never run before. You have to go out there and you have to put in the time and energy. You have to work hard, intentional practice in order to improve. And ultimately, if you can get down to that 5 by 5 by 5, you're going to be in really good shape.
Rod?
I think the one thing to consider there too is the fact that especially for people that haven't done this as part of their process, finding 5 things is amazing. You can turn that into a very personalized sequence. We had something similar at Vorsight. We called it 3 by 3, 3 pieces of information, 3 minutes. If you had to sacrifice one, if you had to sacrifice either the information or the time, you would always sacrifice the information, because your time is your most valuable non-renewable resource, right? And you have to generate a lot of activities to be able to produce meetings. So for those of you that haven't done anything like this before, start with 1. And the biggest thing is, any level of personalization is better than no personalization. It doesn't really matter. Obviously, if you pick the exact right thing, like, hey, I saw that your company, I saw that you guys put out a press release that you're buying business to business data. Wow, that's the best piece of, that's the best golden nugget I can use at ZoomInfo to reach out and be like, hey, I saw that you're looking for data. Let's do it, right? Ideally, your one piece of information is going to fast track you right into selling your product. But at this stage, if you've never done this before, find anything, and I would value something that you're comfortable leveraging. I've worked with people. I used to work with this guy, and whatever university our prospects had gone to, he would say, oh, I saw that you went to Ohio State. My dad went there. That was his thing. That was his piece that he felt comfortable leveraging. I don't know. I'm not advising you do that. I feel like there's some moral implications there. But the point is, he felt comfortable leveraging it, and he was able to do it quickly and effectively, such that it did not hurt his metrics, right? So again, 5 things is amazing. If you've never done this before, start with 1. Take a baby step.
Yeah. I feel like we need to do a part 2 of this, fellas, but because I want to get to a couple questions here that I think that are everyone kind of upvoted here. Peyton Perez asked the question, are you using the same approach consistently day to day, or are you constantly changing your processes daily, weekly to sort of see what sticks? There might be kind of an A/B testing kind of part of that question too, but how often do you guys think about changing stuff, testing approaches, that sort of stuff?
Constantly testing and constantly evolving. Although I will say the evolutions are baby steps. They're not, I'm doing this in this one way today, and then tomorrow I'm going to do this in this entirely distinct way. That's not a good way to test. So trust. And if it's one thing, if you're at a team with, 30 other people and you have really well-founded principles, it's another thing if you're one person trying to figure this out yourself. But again, going back to the checklist, if you go to those checklists and you abide by those principles, you're going to be in pretty good shape, and you're going to have a lot of room to iterate and to try new things. Keywords here, different persona introduced here, different type of sequence here, like in-mail first versus cold call first versus email first. There's always something to evolve and test. Just make sure that it's iterative and not something wholesale different than what you've done before, because you're going to end up confusing yourself if you're doing things entirely differently on a Monday versus a Tuesday.
At the same time, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. If your messaging is working, and this is something I've struggled with, I iterate constantly. I'm constantly reading things, talking to people that know more about things than I do, and wanting to change my process. But I've actually had the situation happen where my process was working perfectly, and I still decided to iterate on some piece of it that actually hurt my numbers the following month.
Yeah.
If it's working for you, maybe iterate where you think, how can I scale this? If this email messaging got me meetings, don't change the messaging. Try to produce more emails, right? Maybe iterate where you can scale if it's working, but if it's working for you, don't mess with it.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. We got to roll, you guys. We're getting a lot of demands in the chat for a part two, but I just wanted to give you guys a chance. By the way, thanks ZoomInfo for sponsoring this webinar. So go check out ZoomInfo if you need contact data. But Kyle, where can people go to connect with you, learn more about you, follow you? I'll drop in your LinkedIn profile so people can go follow you. Let's blow up. Let's blow up Kyle's LinkedIn. But where's the best place to check you out, Kyle?
Yeah, so my LinkedIn is there. I try and share stuff maybe 3 or 5 times a week, somewhere in that range. So most of it is on best practices for sellers, SDRs, and AEs, frontline managers. And then if you want to learn more about Clary and how we can help companies run revenue in a more modern way, as I mentioned, we have a new CI product called Wingman that is amazing for a lot of what we talked about today, real-time coaching. So when I'm on this call with you, if somebody mentions a competitor, a battle card pops up and I know exactly what to say, like I love Wingman. So definitely check that out if you're in the market. But it's been a pleasure, Jason, Rod. I feel like we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. Rod, what about you? I'll drop your LinkedIn profile in there. Make sure to blow up Rod's LinkedIn. Where's the best place to check out you and ZoomInfo?
Follow me on LinkedIn. Talk to me if you have questions about data. Obviously, I'm going to try to sell you, but I can also be a consultative person, and I can share with you the experiences of other people that I talk to every day as they progress through their buying journey in the world of data. I'm more than happy to be a resource because I know the value comes around. And I'm doing a lot of these kinds of things. I'm doing more podcasts. I'm doing more webinars. I'm trying to build my own personal brand because it surprises me how few people have heard about things like 5x5x5. It's constantly astounding. Some of these things that I'm realizing now I should be grateful for having a basic foundation of are novel, right?
Yes.
So follow me on LinkedIn and show up where I show up because we're always going to be doing this kind of stuff.
Oh boy.
Awesome. Great, you too. I dropped my LinkedIn profile in there as well. Would love to connect with you guys. Kyle, Rod, thank you for your time today, and everyone else. Appreciate all the participation, and have a good rest of your week. We'll see you.
Thanks, y'all.
Later, everyone. Take
Take care, guys.